Commander Joseph Higdon stood in a Mississippi courtroom looking like prey in a charcoal suit. To Officer Jeffrey Bernard, smirking from his position near the wall, Higdon appeared to be just another black defendant who needed to be reminded of his place. That assumption was about to become Bernard's greatest mistake. The officer misjudged everything: the military posture, the controlled stillness, the eyes that had seen real combat. He failed to recognize he was targeting a Navy SEAL with training designed to neutralize threats in fractions of a second. What happened next wasn't just an assault gone wrong. It was a viral reckoning caught on 17,000 screens. When Bernard raised his boot in rage, he didn't anticipate the precision waiting to meet it. This is the story of how 15 years of corruption collided with unbreakable discipline. And lost. The air in the Meridian County Courthouse felt thick with old injustice. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of defendants who had learned not to expect fairness. The gallery was packed. Mostly black faces, mostly resigned expressions, mostly people who had been through this assembly line before. Standing before Judge Harlan Whitmore's bench was a man who didn't look resigned at all. Joseph Higdon stood 6 feet tall with the kind of shoulders that came from carrying heavy loads through hostile territory. His charcoal suit was expensive but understated, tailored to fit his athletic frame without advertising it. He was a black man in his mid-30s with a close-cropped beard and eyes that tracked movement with unsettling precision. He didn't slouch. He didn't look around nervously. He simply stood at attention, though most people in the room wouldn't recognize it as such. To the casual observer, Joseph might have looked like a businessman, maybe a teacher, perhaps someone's respectable nephew who'd made good and moved away. That was exactly what he wanted them to see. He wasn't wearing his trident pin. He wasn't wearing the commemorative omega his team had given him after their last deployment. Today, he was just a son who'd come home to bury his sister. Next case. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur. Leaning against the back wall, Officer Jeffrey Bernard straightened up. He had salt and pepper hair, a permanent sneer, and 15 years of unchecked authority written into every line of his weathered face. Bernard was known in Meridian, known for his quotas, known for his stops, known for the way he wielded his badge like a weapon against anyone who looked like Joseph Higdon. Bernard caught Joseph's eye and smiled. It was the smile of a predator who'd already tasted blood. The incident had happened 3 days earlier. Joseph had been driving from the funeral home to his mother's house when Bernard's patrol car appeared in his rearview mirror. The traffic stop was textbook harassment. Failure to signal a turn 3 blocks from his destination. When Joseph had calmly requested the officer's badge number and asked to see the dashcam footage, Bernard had escalated. Suddenly there was a claim about the smell of marijuana. Suddenly there were demands to search the vehicle. When Joseph politely declined without a warrant, Bernard's face had turned crimson. The arrest for resisting and disorderly conduct had been pure retaliation. Joseph knew it. Bernard knew it. And somewhere in a filing cabinet at the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, federal investigators knew it too. State versus Joseph Higdon, the bailiff announced. Joseph moved to the defendant's table with the kind of fluid economy that comes from 12 years of military discipline. His public defender, a young woman named Sarah Chun who looked simultaneously exhausted and apologetic, had already told him this morning to take the plea deal. Judge Whitmore and Officer Bernard go fishing together, she'd whispered. This isn't a trial. It's a formality. Joseph had thanked her and declined. He needed this on the record. Judge Whitmore peered down from the bench, his jowls hanging over his collar like melted wax. He and Bernard had been friends since high school. Everyone in Meridian knew it. The concept of an impartial hearing here was a cruel joke, and the packed gallery knew it too. State your name for the record, Whitmore drawled without looking up from his paperwork. Commander Joseph Higdon, Your Honor. Now Whitmore looked up. He removed his reading glasses slowly, studying Joseph with the expression of a man examining something distasteful on his shoe. "Commander? What are you?" "Commander of the local car wash." A few sycophants in the gallery tittered. Bernard's smirk widened. "United States Navy, Your Honor." The courtroom got quieter. Whitmore waved a dismissive hand. "Officer Bernard, tell us what happened." Bernard took the witness stand like he was mounting a throne. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "Your Honor, I observed the defendant swerving erratically on Beaumont Street at approximately 1,400 hours. Failed to signal a turn. When I initiated the stop, he became immediately hostile. Raised his voice, made threatening gestures. I detected the odor of marijuana emanating from the vehicle." "That's a lie." Joseph's voice was quiet, but it cut through Bernard's testimony like a blade. The room went dead silent. "You didn't interrupt Officer Bernard in Judge Whitmore's courtroom. Not if you knew what was good for you." Bernard's face flushed red. "Excuse me? I said that's a lie, officer." Joseph's tone remained even, almost conversational. "I wasn't swerving. I signaled the turn. I wasn't hostile. And there was no marijuana." Whitmore's gavel came down like a gunshot. "Mr. Higdon, you will not speak out of turn in my courtroom. Do you understand me?" "I understand the rules of evidence, Your Honor. I also understand perjury." The gallery gasped. Sarah Chen put her head in her hands. "That's it." Whitmore's face had gone purple. "I find you in contempt of court, and since you clearly don't respect the authority of this court or its officers, I'm sentencing you to 24 hours in county jail for contempt." "Bailiff, restrain the defendant." The bailiff, a younger man named Marcus who Joseph vaguely recognized from high school, hesitated. His hand hovered over his handcuffs, his face uncertain. That's when Officer Bernard stood up from the witness stand. His eyes were glittering with something ugly, something that had been waiting 15 years for the right moment. "I'll handle this one, Marcus," Bernard said, unclipping his own cuffs. "This boy needs to learn some manners." Joseph stood perfectly still as Bernard approached. In his peripheral vision, he noticed movement in the gallery, his childhood friend Darius, phone already raised, recording. Others followed suit. Screens lit up across the back rows. "Turn around," Bernard commanded, his voice loud enough to carry. "Hands behind your back." Joseph turned slowly, offering his wrists. "I'm complying with the lawful order, officer." "Shut up." Bernard grabbed Joseph's left arm and wrenched it upward, trying to force a pain compliance hold that would bring him to his knees. Joseph's arm didn't move. It was like Bernard was trying to bend rebar. His joints locked, his core engaged, his SEAL training making his body an immovable object. "Stop resisting," Bernard shouted, playing to an audience he thought was on his side. He kicked at Joseph's legs, trying to sweep them out. Joseph adjusted his stance slightly, absorbing the impact, remaining upright. "Officer, I am not resisting. Do not strike me." But Bernard was past hearing. He was past thinking. 15 years of unchallenged power, 15 years of humiliating people who looked like Joseph Higdon, 15 years of rage at anyone who dared to stand up straight in his presence. It all came boiling to the surface. He stepped back, planted his weight, and launched a vicious front kick aimed directly at Joseph's spine. To the people in the gallery, it happened in a blink. To Joseph, who had spent 15 years training to process threats at the speed of thought, time crystallized into perfect clarity. He saw Bernard's hip rotate, saw the weight transfer from back foot to front, saw the trajectory of the boot before it left the ground. Joseph didn't panic, didn't flinch. As the boot came flying toward his back, He executed a movement so economical it barely looked like movement at all. A pivot on his left foot, a subtle shift of his torso, and suddenly he was inches to the side of where he'd been standing. Bernard's boot met empty air. His momentum, all 240 pounds of it committed to the kick, carried him forward. Off balance. Vulnerable. Joseph's hand came up, still cuffed, still controlled, and redirected Bernard's ankle, guiding the arc of his fall. Then, with a precision that came from 1,000 training repetitions, Joseph used his shoulder to complete what Bernard's rage had started. The sound of Officer Jeffrey Bernard hitting the courtroom floor shook the entire gallery. He landed flat on his back, the wind exploding from his lungs in a wet gasp. His service weapon clattered across the tile. His radio squawked uselessly against his hip. The courtroom erupted. People jumped to their feet. The bailiff froze, hand on his taser, completely uncertain about what he'd just witnessed. Judge Whitmore was standing now, his face an apocalyptic shade of red. Joseph didn't move toward Bernard, didn't kick him, didn't gloat. He simply stood there, still handcuffed, breathing evenly, looking down at the officer with something that might have been pity. Bernard scrambled to his hands and knees, gasping, his face contorted with humiliation and rage. His hand reached for his service weapon. "I wouldn't do that, officer." Joseph's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through fog. Every eye in the courtroom turned to him. "You're currently being live-streamed to 17,000 people and counting." He nodded toward the gallery, where Darius's phone was held high, its screen showing a climbing viewer count. Other phones surrounded it, a constellation of digital witnesses recording every second. "Judge Whitmore," Joseph continued, his voice still calm, still measured, "I respectfully request that you note for the record that Officer Bernard just committed aggravated assault on a restrained defendant in open court. I defended myself using minimal force necessary to prevent injury. I did not strike the officer. I did not escalate. And every moment of his attack is now documented on approximately 24 devices." Whitmore's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out. Darius spoke up from the gallery, his voice steady. "Your Honor, I've already forwarded this footage to the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the FBI Civil Rights Division. Timestamp is locked in. No one's deleting anything." The judge's gavel hand trembled. What none of them knew, what Joseph had been careful not to reveal until this exact moment, was that he'd been cooperating with the Department of Justice for 3 months. Since the day he'd learned how his sister Nicole had really died. Since he discovered that her arrest 2 years ago on fabricated charges by Officer Bernard had cost her the job that provided her health insurance. Since he'd traced the line from Bernard's vindictive ticket to Nicole's inability to afford her diabetes medication to the complications that had killed her at 32 years old. Joseph had spent 3 months quietly documenting, carefully recording, patiently building a case. He had flown home on leave not just to bury his sister, but to let Bernard's own arrogance bury Bernard. And now, in a courtroom packed with witnesses, broadcast to thousands of screens, Officer Jeffrey Bernard had just handed the federal government everything they needed wrapped in a bow. Justice, Joseph had learned in the Navy, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was patient. Sometimes it waited for the enemy to make the fatal mistake. Bernard had just made his. The Delta heat hit Joseph Higdon the moment he stepped off the plane in Jackson. Even through his dress uniform, carefully pressed and packed for a funeral he'd never imagined attending, he could feel Mississippi welcoming him home the way it always had, with humidity thick enough to drown in memories he'd spent 12 years trying to outrun. The rental car smelled like artificial pine and regret. Joseph drove the familiar highways toward Meridian with his hands at 10 and 2. His speed exactly at the limit, his turn signals deployed with military precision. Old habits. Survival habits. The kind of habits young black men learned early in towns where the wrong eye contact could ruin your day, and the wrong traffic stop could ruin your life. Nicole had been 32. Diabetes, they'd said. Complications from untreated blood sugar. The kind of death that came with a string of medical euphemisms designed to hide a simpler truth. His baby sister had died because she couldn't afford her insulin. She'd lost her health insurance 2 years ago when she'd been fired from her job at the county clerk's office. The official reason was attendance issues. The real reason was the arrest record. A bogus disorderly conduct charge that Officer Jeffrey Bernard had invented after Nicole had politely declined his advances at a gas station. Joseph's mother had told him the whole story on the phone, her voice breaking in the spaces between words. And then, just before hanging up, she'd added something that made Joseph's jaw tighten. "Baby, be careful when you come home. The police here, they're not like what you remember. Especially that Officer Bernard. He's got it out for people like us. Just keep your head down and get through the funeral. Please." Joseph had promised. He'd lied. The patrol car appeared in Joseph's rearview mirror 3 blocks from his mother's house. He recognized the deliberate positioning, close enough to intimidate, far enough to claim coincidence. The cruiser's white hood filled his mirror like a shark sliding beneath a boat. Joseph maintained his speed, signaled his turn onto Beaumont Street a full 50 feet before the intersection, just like the manual required. His rental's dashcam blinked its steady red recording light. The blue lights came alive behind him. Joseph pulled over smoothly, hands visible on the steering wheel before the cruiser had even stopped. Through his side mirror, he watched Officer Jeffrey Bernard emerge. Salt and pepper hair, a swagger that spoke of 15 years without consequences, a hand resting on his service weapon like a promise. Bernard took his time approaching, boots crunching gravel. He stopped at Joseph's window, looking down with eyes that had already decided guilt. "License and registration." Joseph handed them over without a word. Bernard studied the military ID with visible distaste. "You failed to signal that turn, Commander." The rank dripped with sarcasm. "I signaled at 50 feet, officer. My dashcam recorded it." "May I have your badge number, please?" Bernard's jaw tightened. "Step out of the vehicle." "May I ask why?" "I smell marijuana." "Step out. Now." Joseph's hands remained steady, but his mind was already mapping the next 30 seconds. There was no marijuana. There had never been marijuana. But Bernard's nose had probably detected it 100 times before, and those phantom smells had ruined lives. "Officer Bernard, I'm going to comply, but I'm also going to clearly state that I do not consent to any search of my vehicle without a warrant." Bernard's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Boy, you just made this a lot harder on yourself." The handcuffs clicked shut with practiced efficiency. Bernard had called for backup. 2 younger officers who arrived looking confused about why they were arresting a calm man in a button-down shirt standing beside a spotless rental car. But they didn't ask questions. They never did. Resisting arrest and disorderly conduct, Bernard announced to his body camera, his voice taking on the theatrical quality of a man who'd performed this script before. Subject became verbally abusive and physically aggressive during a routine traffic stop. Joseph said nothing. His SEAL training had prepared him for worse than this, for interrogations designed to break minds, for stress positions that tested the body's limits. A small-town bully with a badge was amateur hour. At the station, Bernard shoved him toward the booking desk harder than necessary. "Got another one for you, Martinez. Thought he was special because he's got some military ID. Probably bought it at the surplus store." The booking officer, a young Hispanic man named Martinez, glanced at Joseph's credentials and something flickered across his face. Discomfort. Recognition, maybe. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Bernard leaned against the counter, warming to his audience. You know what's funny? These thugs think wearing a nice shirt changes what they are. Think it makes them better than Officer Bernard. Martinez's voice was quiet but firm. I need his personal effects. Joseph emptied his pockets methodically. Wallet, keys, phone. A folded funeral program with Nicole's face smiling from the front. Bernard picked up the program, glanced at it, tossed it carelessly onto the counter. Well, ain't that sad? Guess crime runs in the family. Martinez's hand tightened around his pen. His eyes met Joseph's for just a second, an apology he couldn't speak aloud. Joseph filed the moment away. Cracks in the system. Small but there. The courtroom smelled like old wood and older injustice. Joseph sat in the gallery watching Judge Harlan Whitmore dispense punishment with the efficiency of a factory line. Case after case, mostly black faces, mostly guilty pleas, mostly fines they couldn't afford that would compound into warrants and jail time and ruined credit and lost jobs. A 19-year-old girl with her grandmother beside her. Guilty. $400 plus court fees. A man in a mechanic's uniform who tried to explain. Guilty. $600 suspended license. A young mother with a toddler on her hip. Guilty. $300 or 10 days in jail. The pattern was surgical. The outcome predetermined. Joseph recognized the faces in the gallery. People who'd been through this before, people who knew someone going through it now, people bracing for their turn. This wasn't a courtroom. It was a toll booth on the road to poverty, and Officer Bernard was the collector. Sarah Chin found Joseph during the recess. She was 26, maybe 27, with dark circles under her eyes and a caseload that had probably broken her idealism within the first month. Mr. Higdon, I've reviewed your file. She kept her voice low. I'm going to be honest with you. Judge Whitmore and Officer Bernard are friends. Have been for 30 years. The best outcome here is you plead guilty, pay the fine, and go home. What's the fine? Probably $800. Maybe a suspended sentence. And if I request a trial? Sarah's expression said everything. Then you'll definitely lose and the penalties will be worse. This isn't about justice, Mr. Higdon. This is about damage control. Joseph looked at the bench where Whitmore sat, shuffling papers with bored efficiency. I want a trial, he said quietly. Sarah closed her eyes. Okay, it's your right. Officer Bernard took the stand like a man who'd rehearsed his lines in the mirror. His hand rested on the Bible with the casual familiarity of someone who'd sworn oaths he had no intention of keeping. Officer Bernard, please describe the events of the traffic stop, the prosecutor droned. Bernard leaned into the microphone. I observed the defendant's vehicle swerving erratically on Beaumont Street at approximately 1400 hours. Failed to signal a turn at the intersection. When I initiated the stop, he became immediately hostile. Raised his voice, made threatening gestures toward me. I detected a strong odor of marijuana coming from the vehicle. Joseph's face remained perfectly neutral. Every word was a lie. Every word would stand as truth. Sarah Chen's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. Officer Bernard, did you administer a field sobriety test? Didn't need to. His behavior was threatening enough to warrant arrest. Did you find any marijuana in the vehicle? Subject refused consent to search. No further questions. When Joseph took the stand, he spoke with the precision of someone giving a military debrief. I signaled 50 feet before the turn. My dashcam footage will confirm this. I was not swerving. I was not hostile. There was no marijuana. I politely declined a warrantless search, which is my Fourth Amendment right. Officer Bernard then told me, and I quote, "Boy, you just made this a lot harder on yourself." Judge Whitmore's gavel cracked like a gunshot. That's enough. You're calling a decorated officer a liar in my courtroom. I'm stating facts, Your Honor. Contempt of court. Bailiff, restrain this defendant immediately. Whitmore's face had gone crimson. 24 hours in county jail will teach you some respect. The gallery stirred. Sarah Chen's shoulders sagged. Joseph stood quietly, hands at his sides, waiting. The bailiff, Marcus Williams, stood frozen with his handcuffs half unclipped. Joseph recognized him now. They'd played basketball together at Meridian High before Joseph had enlisted. Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he moved forward. I'll handle this one. Bernard's voice cut through the tension. He was already standing, already moving toward Joseph with the predatory confidence of a man who'd done this 100 times without consequence. Marcus stepped back. He always stepped back. Bernard closed the distance, his face flushed with something beyond anger. 15 years of unchallenged authority meeting someone who refused to flinch. Turn around, Commander, he said, loading the rank with contempt. Joseph turned slowly, offering his wrists. I'm complying with your lawful order, officer. Bernard grabbed his left arm and wrenched upward, trying to force him to his knees. Joseph's arm didn't move, muscle memory and training making his body immovable. Bernard kicked at his legs. Joseph adjusted his stance, absorbing it. Stop resisting, Bernard shouted to an audience that wasn't buying it anymore. Then Bernard made his fatal mistake. He stepped back, planted his weight, and launched a vicious front kick aimed at Joseph's spine. To the gallery, it happened in a heartbeat. To Joseph, time crystallized. He saw the hip rotation, the weight transfer, the boot's trajectory before it left the ground. He pivoted, minimal movement, maximum efficiency, and suddenly occupied different space. Bernard's boot met air. His momentum carried him forward, off balance and vulnerable. Joseph's shoulder redirected what gravity had already started. The sound of Bernard hitting the defendant's table face first echoed through the courtroom like a crack of thunder. Then he collapsed to the floor, gasping, humiliated, defeated. The courtroom exploded. Darius Thompson stood in the third row, phone held high, its screen glowing with a climbing viewer count. Around him, a constellation of other phones had materialized, 20, maybe 30 devices, all recording, all broadcasting. Judge Whitmore found his voice. Put those phones away. Bailiff, confiscate those devices immediately. Darius didn't lower his phone. Your Honor, I've already forwarded this footage to my attorney, the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the FBI Civil Rights Division. Timestamps are locked. Cloud backup is complete. His voice was steady, almost cheerful. You're welcome to take my phone, but the video's already in 8 different servers across 4 states. Other voices joined from the gallery. Mine too, Judge. Already sent it. My cousin in Atlanta has it. It's on Twitter. Joseph remained perfectly still, hands still cuffed behind his back, breathing even. For the record, Your Honor, Officer Bernard just committed aggravated assault on a restrained defendant in open court. I defended myself using minimal necessary force. I did not strike the officer. I did not escalate. And every second of his attack is now documented evidence. Whitmore's gavel hand trembled. His face had gone from red to ashen. Bernard, still on the floor, looked around at the phones pointed at him like accusatory fingers. For the first time in 15 years, Officer Jeffrey Bernard understood what accountability looked like. The video hit 10 million views before Joseph was released from custody. By the time he walked out of the Meridian County Courthouse 2 hours later, it had become a national news story. Cable networks looped the footage. Bernard's kick, Joseph's evasion, the sickening crunch of the officer hitting the table. The hashtag Justice for Joseph was trending worldwide. What the media didn't know yet was that Joseph had been expecting this moment for 3 months. The day he'd learned how Nicole really died, how Bernard's fabricated arrest had cost her the job that provided her insulin, how she'd rationed her medication until her body couldn't compensate anymore. Joseph had made a phone call, not to a lawyer, not to the local police, to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. He'd spent 3 months as a confidential informant, documenting everything. Traffic stop patterns that disproportionately targeted black drivers. Testimony from victims too afraid to come forward. Falsified police reports. A ticket quota system that treated black neighborhoods like ATMs. Nicole's medical records and termination paperwork connecting the dots between Bernard's badge and her death. Joseph had built the case methodically, the way he'd been trained to plan operations. Then he'd flown home and waited for Bernard to be Bernard. By 6 p.m., 3 FBI vehicles pulled up to the courthouse. Special Agent Jennifer Kwan walked through the front doors with a warrant for Officer Jeffrey Bernard's arrest. Federal charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, falsification of records, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. They found Bernard in Whitmore's chambers, still trying to spin the narrative. The judge was served with his own paperwork 30 minutes later. The system that had protected them for 15 years was finally done looking the other way. 8 months later, Joseph stood in the back of a federal courtroom in Jackson, Mississippi, watching Officer Jeffrey Bernard learn what accountability felt like. The man who'd terrorized Meridian for 15 years looked smaller now, diminished in an orange jumpsuit, his swagger replaced by the shuffling gait of the convicted. The judge read the sentence with clinical precision. 28 years for deprivation of rights under color of law, falsification of official records, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and aggravated assault. Bernard would be 70 before he breathed free air again. Judge Harlan Whitmore had been disbarred 3 months earlier. He faced his own federal charges for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The fishing trips with Bernard had been meticulously documented in the DOJ's investigation. Joseph had returned to active duty 2 weeks after the courthouse incident, but he'd flown back for this. He owed Nicole that much. After the sentencing, Joseph drove to Pinecrest Cemetery. Nicole's headstone was simple granite with her name, her dates, and the words, "Beloved Sister," taken too soon. He knelt in the grass, placing fresh flowers beside the marker. "It's done, Nick," he said quietly. "Bernard's going away. Whitmore's finished. And I've got something else for you." That evening, at Meridian's Community Center, Joseph announced the Nicole Higdon Memorial Scholarship Fund. His portion of the civil settlement, $1.2 million, would provide health care assistance and educational scholarships for underserved youth in Meridian. The first recipients would be announced on what would have been Nicole's 33rd birthday. The crowd gathered in the community center wasn't large, but their faces held something Joseph hadn't seen in this town before. Hope. Meridian was healing. Slowly, painfully, but healing nonetheless. Justice, Joseph had learned, wasn't just about punishment. It was about making sure the next generation didn't have to fight the same battles. Nicole would have liked that. This story mirrors countless real-life cases where body cams and brave citizens have exposed corruption. It forces us to ask what would have happened if Joseph wasn't a SEAL. That's why we must share stories like this to demand justice for everyone, not just the elite. If the story fired you up, hit that like button to help us spread the message. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story where karma strikes back instantly. What would you do if you were in Joseph's shoes? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe and stay disciplined.